Russia's border doesn't end anywhere. Vladimir Putin said back in 2016, seemingly as a joke. Russia's boundless horizon has always been central to the imperial imagination, an idea woven into Russia's national myth. This motive appears cyclically and is constantly present in Russia, as can be seen on these Moscow billboards. What is more, it awakens the national ego and calls for the maintenance of expansionist identification, as on this billboard saying, "Alaska is ours." For decades, Russia's geography was seen as its greatest strategic asset. Vast spaces, resources spread across hundreds of kilometers, and a depth of territory that seemed impossible to penetrate. Today, the same geography is turning into a liability. Ukrainian long-range drones are striking refineries scattered from St. Petersburg to Bashkortostan. This economic and military front now extends hundreds, even thousands of kilometers into Russia, and there is simply no way to defend so much land. In recent weeks, Ukrainian strikes have already hit facilities representing nearly half of Russia's refining capacity. Long lines at gas stations, restrictions from Transneft, warnings to oil producers. It is no longer a wartime anomaly, but a strategic trend. One in which Kyiv holds the advantage: cheaper, asymmetric pressure against Moscow's sprawling infrastructure. Russia, meanwhile, continues searching for a breakthrough on the battlefield, even as it stages the smallest Zapad military drills in years. Now let's take a closer look at all that. Let's start with the most pressing issue. On September 13th, Ukraine carried out a massive drone strike against critical infrastructure inside Russia. According to Russian claims, at least 361 drones entered their airspace and were allegedly shot down. Yet many still got through. Among the targets hit was the Kirishi refinery, one of the two largest facilities of its kind in the country. Reports suggest it was forced to suspend up to 40% of its production capacity. Even more striking, Ukraine's long arm reached as far as Bashkortostan, hitting the Novoufimsk refinery nearly 1,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, as well as the Salavat refinery, located at a similar distance. For the first time since the war began, Ukraine also struck Russia's largest oil export terminal, Primorsk, a critical hub on the Baltic pipeline system with a daily capacity of over 1 million barrels. That's more than 10% of Russia's total oil production. Just a few weeks earlier, in August, Ukraine had already targeted another export terminal for oil and gas in Ust-Luga. President Volodymyr Zelensky called these strikes the most effective form of sanctions. According to Reuters, the continuing wave of attacks has forced Transneft, the state oil pipeline monopoly responsible for transporting over 80% of Russia's crude oil, to warn producers they may need to cut output. In recent days, the company has limited storage space for oil firms in its pipeline system. The fallout is beginning to reach ordinary Russians as well, who are increasingly struggling with fuel shortages. This video, reportedly filmed in Nizhny Novgorod, shows long lines at a gas station. Other residents complain of sharp price hikes in recent weeks. Even acknowledged Russian outlets such as Kommersant report on these issues. In less than 2 months, Ukraine has struck 14 Russian refineries, a total of 19 times, with some hit multiple times. After the latest strike on Salavat, analysts estimate that all recent attacks combined have targeted facilities responsible for up to 45% of Russia's total refining capacity. That doesn't mean nearly half of production is offline. Refineries are sprawling complexes and repairs are often carried out quickly, but the disruption is significant. These are not isolated fires. Some estimates suggest Ukraine may have managed to knock out as much as 20 to 25% of Russia's total refining capacity. although Konrad Muzyka from Rohan Consulting estimates that number at even 36%. Given that oil and gas exports account for roughly half of Russia's budget revenues, the stakes are enormous. With the 2025 budget set at 41 trillion rubles, about $450 billion, sustained disruption at the 25% level could cost the Kremlin up to $55 billion annually, roughly a quarter of all military spending. But the bigger blow lies beyond the balance sheet. Fuel shortages translate into paralyzing effects across logistics and the wider Russian economy, undermining Moscow's imperial agenda in ways that cannot simply be priced in. This clearly explains why the Ukrainian command set priorities it did. The single most important pillar of the Russian state is hydrocarbons, so the logical imperative is to degrade that pillar with full force. There are several tools to achieve that goal: ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, or medium and long-range drones. The first two options are expensive, long dependent on Western partners, though that is beginning to change, and technically difficult to develop and field in large numbers quickly. That is why the emphasis must fall on long-range drones, used alongside the drones needed on the front lines. That is how the Ukrainian command's calculations could have played out. It was from this logic that platforms such as An-196 Lyuty, the FP-1 and the UJ-22 Airborne were developed. Now that picture is being supplemented by long-range cruise missiles, though they should be treated with healthy skepticism. According to an investigation by the Kyiv Independent, the firm Firepoint is currently under scrutiny by anti-corruption authorities. Now, returning to the clear aim of degrading Russia's refining capacity, it is not that Moscow fails to see or downplay this trend. Quite the opposite. Russia is trying to blunt it with air defenses and preemptive strikes on Ukrainian drone facilities. But overall, Moscow is on the wrong side of the equation. In a war between actors of unequal strength, the weaker side's rational strategy is to exploit all available asymmetries. Refineries, long-range drones, and Russia's geography are a textbook case. Strategically vital refineries are being struck by relatively cheap, mass-produced drones dispersed across the vast interior of the Federation. In this instance, Russia's boundless geography becomes a staggering Achilles heel. Moscow cannot defend every square kilometer, and even critical sites like refineries. Ukrainians therefore strike with impunity, and as the last 2 months show, the attacks are not abating but intensifying. A partial remedy would be to deploy inexpensive anti-drone systems at every key facility. But Russia is huge, and its multi-layered air defense resources are insufficient. The blanket is simply too short. Still, Russia is trying to stretch that blanket as far as it will go, and the latest display of pulling the shit tight came during the Zapad 2025 exercises. The key phase of these maneuvers, often hyped online as a show of force, took place from September 12th to 16th. Putin claimed 100,000 troops would take part, but estimates put the real figure closer to 10 to 15,000, by far the smallest Zapad in years. Unlike the 2021 edition, which involved nearly 200,000 soldiers, this year's exercises posed no real threat to NATO, though they still featured nuclear scenarios and offensive operations. NATO states, in turn, prepared a coordinated response to Zapad. First, just days before the drills began, Poland shut its land border with Belarus, and crucially, it has not reopened it even after the active phase of Zapad ended. The closure not only disrupts EU-Belarus trade, but also hits the so-called northern branch of the new Silk Road, which runs from China through Russia and Belarus into Europe. While that route has lost much of its significance since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the so-called Middle Corridor gaining ground, China has still been moving part of its exports to Europe along it. However, this is a much bigger problem for the Republic of Belarus. Poland's foreign ministry has announced the border will reopen only if Minsk releases political prisoners and halts hybrid attacks on the EU border. There are signs that Beijing may step in to mediate. In addition, Poland, Lithuania and Latvia have partially closed their airspace along the Belarusian border, and for now that restriction remains in force. Yet above all, Poland and NATO more broadly answered Zapad 2025 with its own maneuvers. Iron Defender 25. Several air bases hosted hundreds of NATO aircraft, while training grounds in Ustka, Orzysz and Nowa Dęba gathered as many as 34,000 troops, likely more than Zapad itself. Exercises included rapid deployment of NATO forces into Alliance's eastern flank, interoperability of Allied air forces, with F-16s, F-35s, Eurofighters and AWACS taking part. And unsurprisingly, after the recent Russian drone incursion, counter-drone and missile defense drills. For the first time in Poland, Patriot systems actually fired live missiles. When Russian drones crossed into NATO airspace, the fallout was twofold. Militarily, the alliance reinforced its eastern flank with extra aircraft and naval assets. Diplomatically, however, the response was muted. Poland invoked Article 4, but Donald Trump, NATO's chief guarantor, repeatedly downplayed the incident as a possible, quote, mistake, despite allies insisting it was deliberate. Still, ironically, the incursion may prove damaging for Moscow. Since the start of the war, Warsaw has concentrated on acquiring extremely expensive, high-end military systems. Patriots, F-35s, tanks and frigates. Systems vital for deterring a full-scale war, but ill-suited against swarms of cheap drones. The strike of just a few dozen UAVs exposed that gap. Poland scrambled advanced jets and missile batteries against threats thousands of times cheaper, while Ukraine counters drones with layered, low-cost defenses and saves high-end assets for missiles. The episode triggered an urgent debate inside Poland on how to close this vulnerability, ideally in partnership with Ukraine. Within days, Polish leaders traveled to Kyiv to discuss joint production and deeper defense ties. Talks produced agreements on a drone task force, industrial cooperation with EU financial instruments such as SAFE, and sharing Ukraine's battlefield experience. If Poland and NATO acts on these lessons, the Kremlin strike could backfire. Meant to show strength, it may instead accelerate Allied mobilization. Even the idea of NATO intercepting Russian missiles over Ukraine remains on the table, though such a step would require unanimous approval. Alongside defense, economic cooperation is emerging. Poland's development agency chief proposed a European gauge rail line from Odessa through Silesia to Gdańsk, forming a Baltic Black Sea corridor. He also floated investing in a Black Sea port and a cargo terminal near Kyiv. Such projects immediately recall the popular Intermarium concept, in which precisely these kind of infrastructure and logistics projects form the arteries of regional integration. However, this remains impossible in wartime, while there is no indication that it will end soon. Russia's edge on the battlefield has yet to translate into any true strategic breakthroughs. The Russian breach near Dobropilya in Ukraine's new Donbas line of fortifications that we covered a few episodes back sparked real concern, but ultimately failed to expand into anything larger. The situation in the region remains uncertain, but overall it looks stable. Peter Dickinson went so far as to write in the Atlantic Council, quote, "Putin's failed summer offensive shatters the myth of inevitable Russian victory." Fresh hope for Ukraine's defense also comes from Washington. The US has approved new arms sales to Kyiv, reportedly pushed forward by Undersecretary of Defense Elbridge Colby, who now plays a key role in shaping US foreign policy. The initiative falls under a new mechanism called the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, which covers two tranches worth $500 million each. Washington also keeps pressing allies to choke off Russia's energy revenues. Hungary and Slovakia still import Russian oil, while Belgium, France and Spain buy Russian LNG. Brussels is expected to move up the current 2028 Russian hydrocarbons phase-out, with Poland urging a 2026 deadline. Donald Trump goes even further, demanding the EU impose full sanctions on India and China before the US joins in. Measures that could, in theory, bankrupt Moscow. But such steps are seen as unrealistic. European industries fear losses, and Beijing refuses to be coerced. China profits from Russia's dependence, but a total collapse would also undermine its own global standing. In other words, Trump knows full well that Brussels won't move, allowing him to shift the blame for prolonging the war, which he promised to end in 24 hours, onto the Europeans. And even if the EU somehow imposed such sanctions, Beijing would likely keep Moscow afloat, deepening its vassal status. These quote for the chess moves only underline one key truth. In the end, it is not bold threats or ultimatums. Does anyone even remember Trump's 50 days ultimatum? That matter, but Ukraine's ability to relentlessly strike at Russia's oil sector. In that light, Zelensky's words that refinery attacks are the best form of sanctions sound more obvious than ever.